It is with great pleasure that I introduce J.F. Martel to you this morning. J.F. Martel is an author, podcaster, screenwriter, and film and TV director from Ottawa, Canada. His screen work includes French and English language documentary series and features focused on culture and the arts. He is the author of Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice, a book about the nature and power of art. And those of you who were with us about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I used that book in my talk because it is a brilliant, brilliant way of looking at art, and I definitely highly recommend it to you. JF's writings on culture and art and philosophy, and I should underline philosophy, he's a brilliant philosopher, I think, have appeared in Reality Sandwich, Metapsychosis, The Finch, Disinfo, and other magazines. It is great to introduce to you JF Martel.
Hello, JF. Welcome.
Hello. Hi, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for coming. So you, one of your big projects right now is the Weird Studies podcast that you do with your co-host, Phil Ford. And on a little blurb on the internet that describes it, you say, the weird is that which resists any settled explanation or frame of reference. You talk mostly about art on that podcast, but you have a very specific way of approaching it. And I'm curious what is that project to you guys, and what inspired you to do it, you and Phil?
Well, Phil Ford is he's a musicologist from the University of Indiana in Bloomington, and he and I began a correspondence. It started around my book. He did an event with me here in Ottawa in 2015, and then we started to write emails to one another, long emails, like 16,000 word emails. And eventually it kind of evolved into the podcast. So we just wanted to kind of take our conversations online so that we could, share some of our discoveries with others, because we found that when we talked, we both kind of learn things, not just from one another, but we kind of just discovered things, found things. And so Weird Studies is all about trying to do that in a podcast form, searching for things. And so the weird to us is a word we use to point to that radical mystery that is kind of the default mode of human existence, right? That we tend to cover up and forget about as we get caught up in the business of living. But we like to remind ourselves of that mystery, and to us, art is the prime engine for leading us back to that radical mystery. And that's the thesis of Reclaiming Art, was that this is precisely what art can do that other modes of inquiry have trouble doing, or don't do in the same direct and radical way, let's say.
And some people may not know, in my other life, I was an Old English professor, and so weird is right out of Old English. We're talking the beginnings of the English language. It used to be spelled W-Y-R-D, but in those days that meant fate. And so if something like, someone falls over dead, you say, that's weird, because fate has intervened right into the historical moment. And it's weird that weird has remained all the way through the English language, and we still say, wow, that's weird. And now you study it.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating word. Eric Davis, he's a brilliant writer on matters of technology, myth, religion. He wrote a wonderful essay about the etymology of the word weird. And it's very, very strange and interesting to track how the word has evolved through time. It used to mean fate, as you say. a kind of destiny. It had intimations of providence or of the gods coming and intervening, let's say, in our world. But today we use it to mean things that make no sense, things in a sense that have no discernible purpose, or sometimes things that seem to point to powers that we didn't think existed. For example, if we experience a really meaningful synchronicity, like a crazy coincidence, we'll say, "Oh, that was weird," but we don't mean it in the way that the ancient Anglo-Saxons would have meant it, which was, that's the gods coming in and telling us something. We mean it like, well, we have no explanation for this. That's really weird, and it makes me feel very uncomfortable. So the phenomenon of the weird, to me, as it exists in modern times, is a sign to me that we really haven't settled everything when it comes to figuring out our place in this universe. And it points to the limits of our modern construal. It points to the edge zone where we don't really know what's going on, and that's precisely where we encounter that mystery again, right?
And Jacob, now you are taking a class. Is that how this is working?
I took JF's art and contemplation class over the summer, and I actually just signed up for a new class that he has coming up called Weird Religion, which I'm looking forward to.
Cool.
Yeah, and I one of the things that I really loved in that class was how you outlined, kind of partially using Buber's notion of I thou, just the important way that art it helps facilitate this individuation process, and you specifically in your book contrast individualism with individuation. And in that kind of need to view things in life from this thou perspective, where rather than reducing things to just the simple ways that we can explain them, art can really celebrate a specific relationship that we have with the world around us in a way that it defines it, but also opens it up and acknowledges that it's something weird, something that we can't fully grasp in a kind of quantitative way.
Right. And the I thou bit, that's not something that I wrote very much about in the book. It's something that's been growing on me since then. But it seems to me that all art, by definition, seems to call us to an I-thou relationship with the world. When El Greco paints a stormy sky above Toledo in Spain, the clouds are not just clouds anymore. Those storm clouds are a kind of thou, a kind of divine intelligence, something that means, something that signifies, but also that means to, that intends something. When Van Gogh paints sunflowers, he's not doing what a botanist would do, drawing a diagram of sunflowers. He's calling attention to a specific set of sunflowers which look back at him even as he gazes at them. And so there's this, it seems to me that to call us back to mystery is always to call us back to a kind of primal I thou, which we all kind of, I would say, we all feel deep down when we look out at the world, at others around us, at nature, at the universe. It never manifests itself immediately as just a mere it or a bunch of its. It always comes to us as a kind of thou, a kind of presence, a kind of intention or intelligence. So whether or not that's actually the case, art seems to invite us to entertain that possibility, and in so doing reminds us of the fact that we know a lot less than we think we do when it comes to our place in this in creation, right?
One of the things that I find fascinating is your argument or contention that art is essentially timeless. I mean, the other day when I talked about this, I showed some of the cave paintings, and the amazing thing about those is they just hit you in the face. It's completely timeless. We know exactly what's going on. So, what is it about art that achieves that? Do you think? How does that happen?
Well, that's the great mystery, and Phil and I are constantly trying to investigate that weird truth that I think it's a truth that it's like Picasso. This is apocryphal, but supposedly Picasso went to check out the caves of Lascaux in France, and when he came out, he said they invented everything. Basically, the very, very first artists had already figured out, what art can do, and had found the techniques they needed to convey the mystery through the aesthetic. It seems to have appeared suddenly. Even archaeologists, paleontologists will often wax almost in a kind of religious language when it comes to the sudden emergence or explosion of art onto the human scene. How do we explain that? Well, this is where a purely rational science will fail us, perhaps, because it's very hard to imagine how we might be able to leap into this mode that we, as beautiful as the constructions of various types of animals are, and as aesthetically pleasing as they are, there seems to be a kind of fundamental difference between what animals do and what humans do. And that's a very difficult chasm to bridge empirically. So my tendency is to think of it in terms of something more religious. When John writes about logos at the beginning of the fourth gospel, to me, it's pointing us to something like a kind of cosmic mind that manifests through humans. So, and you could equate that with what the Chinese sages called the Tao. It's not causal, so it can't find its causes in history or in prehistory. It's somehow timeless, and art for me is a kind of sign pointing us back to that strange power that for some reason chose to manifest through human beings, for better and for worse. Because when you bring in the logos, you bring in the capacity for evil. You don't prosecute a killer whale for eating a seal, but in human society, the moral horizon arises for me at the same time as the aesthetic horizon does. So the fall, we could say, is also the promise of some kind of return to the mystery, or some kind of union with it, perhaps. I don't know.
Well, by the way, everybody, in our chat, we do have some links so that you can read some things by JF out there, get a hold of his book, and find some essays, and the podcast, obviously, because they're really, really cool. I was reading this morning, and here we are in a religious or post-religious institution here. And so I was reading about your reflections on Nietzsche and the death of God and the discovery of the planet Pluto, which you make some really cool connections. Of course, this is happening in the early 1930s when the world is really falling into fascism, and by golly, we may be looking at that horizon once more. And you quote the British novelist D.H. Lawrence, "We've got to live no matter how many skies have fallen." And that really struck me, that number one, that D.H. Lawrence was looking at that, but also that you were reflecting on that. Can you say something about that? We've got to live no matter how many skies have fallen.
Wow. That's a big, okay. So it seems to me that I agree with the view that modernity, to a certain extent, was a taking heaven by storm kind of affair. Um, it's not for no reason that people like Copernicus and Galileo were treated with fear and apprehension, because the people of the time, the educated classes, basically the clergy, could feel that something big was coming, a big change that would mean a total upheaval. And modernity is that upheaval. We have crossed a threshold, and Nietzsche was, I'd say, a prophet of that. He wrote brilliantly about the consequences of all those skies falling, of the great chain of being coming undone, and all that. And so in that essay, I was trying to frame the discovery of Pluto as a kind of synchronistic event in the story of our coming to terms with those falling skies, that realization. However, to me, that whole chapter, the doubt that Nietzsche radicalized and absolutized, is part of something bigger, a process whose final endpoint we can't know. But I think it's too hasty to think that Nietzsche kind of nailed the coffin when it comes to religion. I think that there's a lot more going on in the universe. And I think to say that God is dead is also strangely an affirmation of God in a weird way. And I don't know how I could untangle that weirdness without taking up the rest of our time. But I think that facing the problem of modernity squarely in the face is part of what we're going to do next month in this new class. We're going to be asking some hard questions about the modern, but also about the religious, and about how we can somehow find a way through what all too often manifests as a kind of abyss yawning under us right now, an abyss of meaning, an abyss of truth, of value. I do think we need to think our way, and perhaps, feel our way, create, create our way out of this this strange time we're in. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but
it's weird. It's weird. Yeah, that kind of connecting to one of the things you said in the class that I just really reframed art and religion for me. It was you saying that religion is art, and it also kind of calls to mind maybe the uses of art/religion. In one of your recent episodes, you talked about the work of John Carpenter, which was great. I love John Carpenter. I forget the exact quote, but I think it was that episode where you said something along the lines of, we have to damn ourselves in art in order to save ourselves in reality. And yes. I wonder, the way that art and religion work in tandem, things like revelations in the Bible, and the necessity of, work like John Carpenter's, which, he has many pieces that kind of seem to be meditating on a revelations kind of vision of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems to me that the perfect polity, the perfect kind of social situation for the artist is one of absolute freedom. Not because it's important that everybody gets to express their opinion, but because it's in the spirit of absolute freedom. It's in that zone that you make real discoveries as an artist. And so, and the reason we should want artists to feel this freedom to express, to go into the darkest places and the most beautiful and sublime places, to be able to have the reason we should celebrate artists, for example, like William Burroughs, who went to some very dark places indeed in his literary work. The reason is because we can learn from what they find there. Art shows us the best in humans, but it also shows us the worst. it must show us both sides. The strange irony is that art is, insofar as it's an aesthetic thing, it's amoral in that sense. It can go anywhere. You can have like really dark black metal, from like Eastern Europe that kind of freaks us out, but also awakens us to its opposite, or to what it's negating, or to what it's weirdly affirming. We need to be able to accept that we have this zone, this forum we've created called art, where people express themselves, because by doing so, we get to learn who we are, what forces inhabit us, what drives us. And sometimes I'm afraid, because it seems to me like today it's harder and harder for artists to feel that they have that freedom for various socio-political reasons. And I think it's something we should really try to preserve and protect, because, I'll go back to William Burroughs. He called his book Naked Lunch, and it was Jack Kerouac who suggested the title. And the term naked lunch signifies the moment where reality freezes and you get to see what's at the end of every fork at like the feast, And so you, in unflinchingly expressing that vision, Burroughs allows us to see the forces at work in our world and in ourselves, especially. So that when art can be done in that spirit, I think it can be revelatory. It can occasion revelation, and it does extend and continue the tradition of prophecy in the modern world.
Teacher, and I should mention that's probably why I can't write fiction anymore, is because William Burroughs is just, I think he went to a place that most of us can't go, and and of course that's the beauty of Burroughs and his work. We're almost out of time, just got a couple of minutes, but I did want to ask you about what you call the assault on interiority.
Right.
You make a differentiation between art and artifice, and then you say we are living in an assault on interiority. So let's conclude with that. Would you?
Sure. Okay. Well, no, everybody knows we live in a hyper-mediated technological society where we are continuously incited to externalize ourselves through social media, through various communications technologies and all that. So it goes deeper than that, but I think that's probably the easiest way to see how the interior is being externalized today, and that it's getting harder and harder in our very hyper busy age to cultivate interiority. It's harder and harder to read books, to meditate, to take walks without earphones, to cultivate the inner garden, and to thereby engage in what Jacob was talking about earlier, individuation, developing what James Hillman, the great psychologist James Hillman, called soul making, to make yourself a soul. And I think that this assault has obvious political advantages to certain groups, obviously, or certain, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, to certain interests, let's say, in society. And I think it's important that we fight against that urge to exist in a purely externalized way through our social media networks and all that, but rather that we occasionally return to that inner solitude, that lonely place within us where we can find visions that are unprecedented, things that no one has thought, because no one like you has existed so far, things that are not possible to label and to categorize. And art, I think, again, a practice of art, a practice not of creating art only, but of reading, watching, listening, can encourage us to build that interior garden where we can rediscover our own singularity.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been great. We'll have in the chat, I believe, all of the various links. And then another, if you're interested in checking out this class that he's teaching, it's called Weird Religion. You can go to neuralearning.com, NURA learning.com, and we'll put that in the chat too. And then one last thing I'll say, that the songs that I performed, that I made videos for, are all songs that they've talked about on their podcast, Lilac Wine, and then the one we will have after the Strawberry Fields Forever. So check out the podcast and their takes on these songs. They're very excellent. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. This has been great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, David. It was a pleasure to be here.